So it is indeed my pleasure to be here. And thank you, Mike, for your leadership in the MRW in presenting this today and moving forward, because this is a vital issue to our state. This is not an east side issue or a west side issue. It's a state of Washington issue. As I travel the state and as I go back home to Moses Lake, there are people in Moses Lake that are as much concerned about the orcas as the people living over here around the Puget Sound. So it's something that both sides really want to look at, and how do we preserve and enhance the orcas. Having served also on the governor's task force on saving the orca, I will tell you I learned a great deal. And it's not an easy issue, and it's a number of complex issues as we look forward and move forward in working with the legislature in the next number of years on how do we continue on the pathway of preserving and protecting and enhancing the orcas. The goal from the group coming out was to increase the number of orcas from the current 73 to 84 by 2028. As I said, many issues affect the orcas. One of them is hatcheries and the production of fish. And as one of the top issues, and if you look at the 2019 report, its goal number one is the hatcheries, and it is getting more fish. One of the goals that we had in that group was to look at putting 50 million more smolt out of our hatcheries this year. Because we know that right now one of the problems with the orcas is they're needing fish. They need more Chinook. They're picky. They like Chinook. And so how do we produce more? And so the legislature this year stepped forward, and they funded through the Fish and Wildlife Department enough money to increase the hatchery production, I believe about 18 million smolt this year. Far short of the 50 million we would like, and maybe we'll be able to ask that question later of Fish and Wildlife. But I think that that 18 million probably will max out their facilities that they currently have. And we're either going to have to come back to the legislature and ask them to increase more hatcheries, or do we do, as our partners in the north have looked to the private sector in doing some type of private-public coming together and working hatcheries in the future and all. And so I'm excited. I did not know about this project. I'm excited as I read more into it as to what is happening into Alaska. And I'm excited that MRW is here saying, hey folks, let's look at something different. I think it is very interesting to have legislators like Senator Rivers step forward and say, we have to do something, let's do something now. And so we're going to learn about what is going on up in Alaska. So our first speaker today on the panel is Doug Thomas of San Juan Area Sea Life. Is the President and Chief Executive he is the Chief Executive Officer of Bellingham Cold Storage, which serves more than 200 customers as they move over 650 million pounds of food product annually. He is a member of Washington State University Foundation Board of Trustees. Doug is the founding chair of San Juan Area Sea Life, a nonprofit organization formed in 2016 with the goal of restoring salmon population to a healthy and robust level. The organization has taken a leading role in helping to bring the Alaska fisheries model to Washington State. And Doug will present some of that to us today. And Doug, thank you for coming today to it.
Thank you, Gary. As Gary said, you're probably wondering why a cold storage guy got involved in salmon and the orca situation. Well, I've been traveling to Alaska to visit customers in various cities and boroughs for about 27 years. And about 7 or 8 years ago, a friend of mine in Juneau who runs an operation there and works collaboratively with the DIPAC hatchery in Juneau, Alaska, what we think to be the best in class or a world-class hatchery, introduced me to Eric Prestegard, who is the executive director at the DIPAC Hatchery. I took a tour the following summer. I took another tour with my wife the following summer after that. I took a tour with a couple of my other business partners after that on subsequent visits. And I started to formulate in my mind, why aren't we trying something like this in the state of Washington? It just made so much sense. And that's when, about 3 years ago, we formed a committee. It wasn't a bona fide 501c3 until just this last month. But the San Juan Area Sea Life was formed, and it contains stakeholders that generally have interest in this Marine Area 7, which this is Whidbey Island, Bellingham Bay, Victoria, British Columbia. This Marine Area 7 is the area we're talking about. Who are the stakeholders? These are the stakeholders that stand to benefit and or have been participating. And what I've done over the last 3 years is each month we bring in a new stakeholder to the committee meeting, and it's an open to the public committee meeting. And there are representatives from WDFW, there are representatives from the Lummi tribe, there's the Port of Bellingham, the City of Bellingham, the tourism component, the K through 12 component, the higher ed component, the sports fishing representatives are there, the commercial fishing reps are there, and the Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Agency, just a number of different organizations. And each month I tried to have them feel like this was their introduction month, and we introduced them, understood how they fit into the mix, and told the story. And really the transparency of the story is causing stakeholders that don't normally play well together. They're all trying to figure out how we can make this work. And they have been privy to presentations by the Eric Prestegard, the DIPAC executive director from Juneau, Alaska, as well as Sam Raybung, who this is the hatchery in Juneau. Also Sam Raybung, who is the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Director of Fisheries. And he gave our group 2 years ago about a 4-hour dissertation on how the government side of this works, how the agency oversight still continues to be in place. And in our case, it would be the co-managers between the tribes and the WDFW. We don't intend to change any of that. We don't intend to change the Bolt decision as far as the tribe having access to 50% of the fishery. We would keep everything the same, only we would go from about 64,000 return fish in Bellingham Bay or the San Juan Islands as a result of the Whatcom Creek hatchery, which is now currently releasing they're currently releasing about 4 million salmon a year. And if you look at the percentage that actually return to the hatchery, it's about 1.6 to 1.8% of that comes back to the hatchery, so about 64,000 adult salmon come back. All of the other fish get consumed by predators, birds, seals, sea lions, orcas, sports fishermen, commercial fishermen, and whatnot. But the two groups that we took, and Senator Rivers was with us this last summer, over the last couple of summers, gets a full-blown 2-day education piece. The hatchery actually takes special care of us, brings us in, gives us a walking tour of every aspect of their operations, and then we have a sit-down Q&A session for about 4 hours. Where they tell us the history of where it started, how they were in dire straits in 1969, and where they are today, whereby in 2013 they actually paid back the state loans to the state of Alaska. I think it was around $43 million that they borrowed, And the cost recovery fishery is so successful that they were able to pay that back. They're now able to run the hatchery's operating overhead costs and annual capital improvement budget just by virtue of the cost recovery fishery. These are some of the differences in those two programs. So in the state of Washington, it's obviously substantially taxpayer-supported model. In the state of Alaska, it's substantially self-supported. And how that works is, and this is in more detail in the white paper that's available to you, but how that works is the first fish coming back is made available economically to the hatchery that produced the fish in the first place. So they recover their costs by virtue of those first fish coming back, and then the balance of that fishery is available to what's called common property fishery for sports fishing, commercial fishing, tribal, subsistence, ceremonial. All of those fisheries are then made available. And effectively, the DIPAC model right now, this last year, I think they used about 17% of the total fishery coming back to cover all of their costs, and then they made the rest of the fishery available for everyone. The state really isn't feeding it with tax dollars any longer, other than some supplemental tax dollars that they're making to increase the number of certain species that they'd like to see. Some king and coho species they'd like to see more than what the hatchery's optimum model is, and so the state budget augments that in a small way. It's nowhere near the lion's share of the funding for the hatchery, though. The lion's share of the funding comes from their cost recovery model. In Alaska, at the DIPAC hatchery and in Bellingham, we would envision a robust education component with an education wing, a robust tourism component, and the other difference for this hatchery is we would adopt the remote release site model, whereby not all of the fish is released from the hatchery itself. They are separated into, say, a third and then brought out to remote release sites dispensed or distributed within the San Juan Islands. And then the pressure isn't on that particular spot. The predators don't come to that particular spot necessarily. There are several spots that they're going to. It spreads the fleet out, spreads the pressure out, and so it just makes it more viable for the fish to come back. They use 100% marking of the otolith bone, which is the inner ear bone, by modulating the temperature of the water while they're in the incubation process. I think the state of Washington does quite a bit of this as well. But that way they can tell where that fish came from, what release point it came from, where it's returning from, what year class it is. All of that information is available to them. And one of the things that helps that model work so well is that budget is not necessarily a ongoing primary concern. So when you have budget constraints, you don't do all of these extra steps or extra things that you could be doing. And I would say that the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has done a great job with the resources and the staff and everything that they have. But have they had everything they need? Probably not. And this self-funding model allows you to have a more robust budget to do the things that help you get the percentages from 1.6 or 1.8 to 2 or 3% or 4% in some cases. So that can be the difference between having a low year of a 2% return being 800,000 fish and a high year being 1.6 million fish. That's a big difference when you're talking about just 1 or 0.5% of the returns coming back. It's a huge number of fish when you can achieve those small little incremental improvements to the hatchery process. I would just say that my primary job is to run a fairly large cold storage. It's the largest portside cold storage on the West Coast. I have a passion for this, but I also don't have a passion for the red tape and the politics that may be causing us to not just go out and get something done you know, I'm a common sense person. I just want to get it done. I don't want all the red tape, and I see that it is effective and it's successful in Alaska, and we can do a feasibility study to prove that out. We do have the Port of Bellingham and a unique water source that is deep and clear and clean, coming from the deepest part of Lake Whatcom, which is unique through a pipeline that used to service the Georgia Pacific Mill. And Mike can talk about that a little bit later. But that is a unique feature there, and it's one that when the Alaska folks come down from the Department of Fish and Game and from the DIPAC Hatchery, they say, you guys have a unique situation here that will really work. This isn't just a run-of-the-mill creek that is warm and dirty and you know, challenging to have high number returns. You have a unique situation here. So, and I'm kind of like, let's not wait 10, 12 years to figure this all out while we're waiting for the orca out there waiting for us to figure this all out. We got to make some bold moves and do some things now and change things and get some shovels in the ground and get this going. And that's my position on it. We've got a great group of stakeholders that represent just about every possible group you can imagine, and they're all very complementary of each other. So I think we have a great opportunity to at least try this on a pilot basis. We don't have to do it across the state in the first go-round, but if it is successful, I think it's a model that could be duplicated throughout the state. So.
Thank you, Doug. Very interesting. So let's move on to the next panel member is Senator Ann Anderson. The senator represents Clark County's, Are you ready?
You good?
Oh, okay. I thought I heard something. 18th District. I will tell you, she is known for taking on tough issues. And I think that's why this is the right one for her to take this issue on. She holds a leadership position in the Senate Republican caucus as a caucus whip. Senator Rivers has had a chance to see the operations, as Doug said, up in Alaska. She was up there and saw it. I did not know she's from Alaska, and she lived up there in Ketchikan. She just returned this summer from DIPAC and will give us your experience and then also the legislation that you're looking at running. So, Senator.
Thank you, Gary. I am Senator Ann Rivers. I'm from Washington's 18th Legislative District, which is down in Southwest Washington. So my district is bordered on two sides by the Columbia River. We are a family of fisher people. And for many, many years in Olympia, I've been engaged in the discussion about gill netting and the Columbia River endorsement and commercial fish versus recreational fish, all of these sorts of things. And then this past session, it all seemed to finally come together when we could talk about the real benefits of fish to our state, the real importance, and that happened when people began to look at the southern resident orca whale in a very serious way. As Gary pointed out, we did some work around that and provided some funding around it, but the reality is that it really, we could have done more. We probably should have done more. But I think right now people are really awake for the first time in some time and talking about fish. So for me, I know that there are some people who feel really strongly about the dams, but I don't think that that there's really a place in today's discussion about dam breaching. And the reason that I don't think that is because we know that it's probably 15 to 20 years before the dams are removed. And the reality is the fish have maybe 12 years. So in Olympia, things take a long, long time, and we can bet that there's going to be some court action that will take a long, long time. And all the while, the orca are waiting for us to get our ducks in a row, or our fish in a row, as the case may be. So if you came to this discussion with some idea that we should be talking about dam breaching, or I respect that. I think we can have that discussion. I just don't think that we should say that. I think that we should focus on this as an immediate something that we can do in order to start feeding the orca right away. Selfishly, I hope that this pilot project works out for the rest of the state, because I hope to be catching some of these fish down in my neck of the woods someday. So we do have a robust hatchery program. I believe that it can be improved with some of the programs that, or the micro programs within the larger program that are being utilized in Alaska right now. And so it's my hope that we can get this going, we can test it and see what works, and then it might be something that could translate to the rest of the state. Our commercial fisheries are the entirety, from the cultural importance of the orca to the financial importance, whale watching and what have you, to commercial fish, how they've been. I don't think people in our state really understand the economic driver that our fisheries present to the people of our state. I know that my husband spends a lot more money on tackle and such than I want him to. So I think that it's quite a wheel. And I think that we have to do what we can do. This perfect storm that we're presented with right now, I see as a real opportunity. I think that if we take advantage of this opportunity and start up in the San Juan area, moving it to the rest of the state, then I think that all the people of our state win. And just so you know, my district sells the second most recreational fishing licenses in the entire state. So my constituency cares a lot about this, even though many of them may never even get a look at an orca, or that's not their dog in the fight, but they're cheering this on because they, like me, see that this is something that could benefit the rest of the state. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Senator. So next is going to be Michael Hogan. Michael is the Public Affairs Administrator at the Port of Bellingham and is a member of the Port's Waterfront Redevelopment Team. Mike studied chemistry and political science at the University of Utah, received a master's in public health at the University of California at Berkeley. Mike has been working on environmental cleanup, habitat restoration, commercial property redevelopment since starting at the port in 2004. And Mike will tell us about the Port of Bellingham, its interest in getting into the hatchery business and producing salmon.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, first of all, a disclaimer, I'm a fisherman and grew up fishing. I spent a lot of time on the waters of Puget Sound and a lot of time enjoying the scenery and not much catching. And I was fortunate enough to marry my beautiful wife, who's from Ketchikan, Alaska, and spent some summers up there. And it's such a different feel when you go to Alaska and you go there and the whole town smells like fish, and you go out on the rivers and you walk across and you step on these dead carcasses, and it is a true, robust, beautiful ecosystem, and much like it once was in Puget Sound. And so I guess to roll back for a second, why is the port interested in this project and potentially improving the hatchery system in Washington? Well, first of all, we have over 200 tenants, and a lot of those are working waterfront tenants, commercial fishermen, folks like Bellingham Cold Storage, whale watching cruises, marine supply stores, boat repairs, you name it. A huge part of our local and regional economy depends on salmon, on orca whales, on the bounty of the sea in Marine Area 7. And so and obviously tourism is a huge component. People come from all around, and what do they want to do? They want to go see orcas. If we have friends in town, it's a no-brainer. You put them on a whale watching cruise and send them out for the day, and it's just an amazing place that we live in. And so I guess the question is, if we are dependent on a hatchery system in Washington, which about 75% of the fish out there are hatchery fish, so we are dependent on it. Why wouldn't you look to, are we using the best practices for running hatcheries related to operation, management, research, education, community engagement? Is there anything that we could be doing that we're not? And so that was kind of the fundamental question that Doug at Bellingham Cold Storage brought to us. And along with his experience up in Alaska, he said, hey, look, I'm not sure what's going on with the hatchery system in Washington. We know the funding goes up or down. We mentioned this past session, the economy is great. There's a huge problem. Everybody recognizes that there's a problem with the orcas. So money went into the hatchery system. But when there's the next recession or funding goes down or the next big issue comes up, those hatcheries still need money. But that money may or may not be there. So that's a problem if we do rely on those hatchery fish. So the Alaska model is really interesting from that cost recovery perspective and being more of a sustainable long-term opportunity to enhance our fisheries. There's also, I think, in Bellingham, we have a really good location. Doug mentioned it. We're doing a big waterfront redevelopment project. There was Georgia Pacific operated a complex pulp, paper, and chemical mill for many, many years on our downtown waterfront. Kind of the change in economy and led to them shutting down their chemical plant in 1999, their pulp mill in 2001. The Port of Bellingham ended up purchasing the property in 2005. It's about 137 acres on our downtown waterfront. And we've been engaged in partnering with the Department of Ecology and with the City of Bellingham to redevelop this property. We opened our first park on the downtown waterfront last year. We just opened up a bike park kind of through the downtown waterfront. We've done a ton of environmental cleanup. So it's really an exciting time. I mean, people, before we acquired the property, what did the community want? They wanted, to rebuild the waterfront economy. They wanted to increase public access to the water. They wanted us to restore the natural environment. And so we're taking a lot of steps in that direction, and there's some really great things going on. This hatchery could fit really well on the downtown waterfront. There was a 48-inch water main that went from that goes from Lake Whatcom down to the downtown waterfront, about 300 feet elevation head. So you could use that water. Historically, Georgia Pacific used it about 60 million gallons of water per day to hydraulically debark logs. So that's existing in-place infrastructure that we could use today. A hatchery would require far less water, but one of the key things hatchery needs is that clean, cold water. So there's an opportunity there. You could run the water down, you could generate hydropower through a turbine and then use the water to support a hatchery operations. So there's a great spot, and there's also really, I think a lot of people in Whatcom County and Washington are really interested in what's going on with the hatcheries, what's going on with the fish, what's going on with the orcas. And to navigate that kind of that community engagement process of what's happening, how do I learn more, it's a little bit complicated. And people, the salmon is, is iconic in our state. And so if we had a hatchery on the downtown waterfront with a visitor center where people could come in and see what's going on, be part of it, be part of the the long-term solution, I think it creates a really good opportunity. That being said, I think this model could work anywhere. It's more about the fish and how do we get fish back into Marine Area 7 and throughout the waters of Washington, the Columbia, and different places, and what can we do to improve our existing system. So it's a really neat opportunity. It falls under our existing legal and regulatory framework. So it's not anything new, but it's a new way of funding. There's some ways to enhance and improve our existing system that we're really excited about. So at any rate, thanks for having me here, and look forward to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Mike. Next is Todd Meyers. Todd is the Director of Center for Environment at the Washington Policy Center. He is one of the nation's leading experts in environmental policy, operating from a free market perspective. He is a published author and a commentator for the Wall Street Journal on issues regarding energy and the environment. Todd formerly served on the executive team at Washington Department of Natural Resources and also was Director of Public Relations and Public Affairs for Seattle Supersonics and the Seattle Mariners. Why'd you lose the Supersonics, Todd? That'll be a different subject that we'll come back and talk about that part of it. And yeah, and Todd will tell us about some of the big picture issues involved in this debate. Todd.
So I currently, I work for the Washington Policy Center, but I currently sit on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council, which is associated with the Puget Sound Partnership. And the Salmon Recovery Council takes a bigger focus than just hatcheries. We focus primarily on habitat, but we look at all of the various problems that face salmon in the Puget Sound and the region. And when people want to know what the salmon face, I take them out to the Ballard Locks, because you can find just about everything that salmon have to deal with at the Ballard Locks. Because in Issaquah, there's a hatchery, and so the fish start at the hatchery, and then they have to go through Lake Sammamish, through the Sammamish Slough, and then to Lake Washington, and then through the ship canal. And in the ship canal, they face runoff and little bits of brake dust and oil and other things that go into the ship canal. And what you see is that if the fish stay in the middle of the ship canal, they do okay. If they get too close to the edge, where there's a lot more of that runoff, they have problems. And then they have to go through the locks. And then at the locks, you can go out there on basically any day. If you want to see seals, the best place to see seals is at the locks, because they know where the fish are. And so then the fish face the gauntlet of the seals and the sea lions. And then they travel out to the ocean. And all of those things contribute. Hatcheries are an important part of making sure that we increase the total population of fish. It is not the only part, but improving the way hatcheries work and trying new things makes a big difference. When I was at the State Department of Natural Resources, we passed the Forest and Fish Law. And one of the requirements of the Forest and Fish Law was to remove culverts, or to fix the culverts, and to open up salmon habitat. And it was a requirement not only of state trust lands, but also of private lands. And they finished it ahead of time, which the goal was 2015. And the reason they did that is because they had a sustainable business model where private timber companies and the state, who earned revenue from timber harvests, had revenue so that if there was a culvert that was near a harvest, you could use some of that revenue to fix the problem that was there. Meanwhile, we are still waiting for the Department of Transportation and other agencies who are reliant on the legislature for funding to do their part, right? And that's the tribes have had to sue. So the more that you can attach a business model to environmental restoration, the more likely you are to see consistent and sustainable results. And so that's why I think this is really interesting, because it takes the model that was successful in opening up fish habitat in our forests and fixing some of the problems we had with culverts, and applies it to hatcheries. Hatcheries are not the only issue, though, and money is scarce. This year, for habitat restoration projects that we voted on the Salmon Recovery Council, we fought very hard for a $10 million increase, and we were happy to get that $10 million. The key question is, where should we put our effort and where should we put our money that we're going to get the most bang for the buck? And hatcheries are one area that you can do that. Habitat is another area where we prioritize what projects will have the biggest impact. Let me just say this last thing about dams, since that seems to have dominated the discussion. If it wasn't for hatcheries, a lot of this debate wouldn't exist. People talk about the Elwha and the removal of the Elwha dams. There's no question that the Elwha dams were a problem. But that was in 2014 that we removed the last dam. Here we are in 2019, and 96% of the fish in the Elwha are hatchery fish. If it was not for that hatchery, there would be, you could remove the dams all you want, there would be no fish on the Elwha. In terms of the cost of tearing down those dams, it's extremely expensive. As I said, we fought for an additional $10 million in habitat in Puget Sound. The costs of removing dams are billions of dollars. If you ask me, if you say, Todd, here's $1 billion, where do you want to spend the money to help orca and salmon? I got a lot of ideas. Way down on the list is spending that on, to roll the dice on one project on the Snake River, because I can do a lot with $1 billion in the Columbia and the Salish Sea. That's what I think we have to focus on, is where do we get the biggest bang for our buck? How can we set up systems that are self-sustaining so that we don't have to constantly rely on the legislature to give the resources that we need? So I think this is an interesting idea that contributes and complements the other efforts we're already taking to save salmon in the orca.
Thank you very much, Todd. Appreciate those comments. I think you're absolutely right. $1 billion would go a long ways to help culverts, would help hatcheries. At the same time, interesting when you bring up the predators, remember it took congressional legislation to start dealing with the predators on the Columbia. We have not got congressional approval in the Puget Sound. And that was one of the disappointing things with the task force, is we're going to study it. We need to study if the population of the seals and sea lions are growing in the Puget Sound. But I think everybody knows those numbers are growing dramatically. We don't need to study it. We need to be looking at how do we start taking care of the predators in the Puget Sound. I found out on the task force and talking to other members, there's a bigger issue on predators in the Puget Sound than there necessarily is on the Columbia River. But we're going to study it here in the Puget Sound and not go any further. I think also, and I may call upon, I told Department of Fish and Wildlife, they do have a person here, and I told them I might call on them and put them on the spot. But I do want to pick up on what I think, Mike, you brought up. And that is, this year the legislature had some extra money. They did not go as far, I agree with you, Senator, that they should have on taking care of the orcas. I think that you're absolutely right, Mike, that in budget cycles, and I think the department would say in the 2008 cycle when the economy dropped off, hatchery money dropped off. So can we rely upon the budget always to be there for hatcheries? And we know from past experience now, that dropped off, and we may be back to where we were prior to the drop-off of the economy. Is that about right, Fish and Wildlife? And could you answer yes or no on it? And then could you also, what is the number, and I think you showed me back in the mid-'80s, we put out way more fish out of the hatcheries than we are currently today. Is that accurate? That's correct. And so can you talk a little bit, the budget, we did drop off quite a bit on hatchery funding in 2008, right?
Correct. Yeah, we lost a lot of general funds in 2008, 9, 10 by 80. We lost a lot of our general funds. So we had to take production cuts across Puget Sound and all around. And trying to rebuild some of that to our current infrastructure max with the additional money we received from the legislature in supplemental budget cycle in 2018 and this last year.
And the funding that you got this year, are you needing him, is better, do you mind coming up here closer to the mic? Okay. Sorry about that. So if you want to go through again some of the drop-off of the budget, and then now with the budgeting this year, does it bring us back to about the level of 2007-8 before the drop in the economy?
Yeah, correct. So we lost a lot of general fund dollars in our budget in the 08, 09 biennials. And we
took production cuts across Puget Sound, reductions. We worked with our tribal co-managers to let them know that that was going to happen because of funding. The last 2 years, 18 supplemental, we received $837,000 to increase hatchery production for orca, and then in 1921 we received $3.5 million annually to increase production for southern residents. We also received some pass-through dollars to our tribal co-managers and 1 PUD on the east side of the state to increase production as well. So we're looking to increase production by about 26, proposal for about 26 million additional fish being released this next year.
And will that put, what is the highest mark that the hatcheries have put out before? Was it up in the 80 million?
Oh, so if we're only talking Puget Sound, so I even brought some numbers to make sure I didn't misquote this. In Puget Sound, all species, we were producing about 135 million in 1989, and now we're about 84 million. Now there's a lot of changes that affected that. Budget was one, mass marking was another one, so we went away from planting fry and other size fish, smaller size fish when mass marking come along, so we could determine which fish are hatchery and which are wild on the spawning grounds.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So I'm going to open it up for questions. And can I take this mic, pull the tape up, and walk over there? Okay. So I'm going to try to repeat your question, so make it easy.
The main thrust of the bill and the plan is, well, simply down to having an extra hatchery in the Bellingham area. I can understand the economic advantages of this, but can someone elaborate on how just one extra hatchery translates a growth from 4 million to 40 million salmon in just 10 or 12 years? That seems like a very exaggerated number just coming from one hatchery.
So I think basically your question is, how can just putting one hatchery up at Bellingham come up with 40 million salmon? I think that I'll let Senator Rivers answer it, but I think we're doing this as a pilot program because most of these need to start out at a pilot program to see how they work. And then slowly, I think the hatchery then would continue to increase. And I think you said you'd like, if it works, let's move it elsewhere.
Right, that's exactly the point, is that this is the area where the orca will have the greatest benefit for the orcas. It is just a pilot project, and Doug has more on the numbers and the way that the numbers work, so I'm going to defer to him on that. But I think that it's just the proximity is perfect, and so that's why this area first, and then if we can duplicate it in other places after we've perfected it. But I'd like for Doug to address the numbers.
Yeah, turn it on. The numbers are not my numbers. They're numbers that came from both Eric Prestegard at DiePack Hatcheries, who looked at our situation and compared that to their own situation in 1976, whereby they took about 12 years to go from 0 to about 40 million fish. And what happens each year is you have to start small. You have to take broodstock from compatible, local, suitable areas, and you then propagate those, incubate them, release them, and then the next year class that comes back, you're taking eggs again, and you go a little bit at a time, very gently and gradually over time. But after about 10 or 12 years, it is thought that we can achieve that. The 40 million salmon released mirrors what was thought to be by both the WDFW representative on our group, as well as the Lummi Nation Natural Resource representative on our group, they both concurred almost independently that 1985 was the recent high water mark. And at that time, there was thought to be around 40 million fish present in the area. And that is our overarching goal. We know we can't achieve it overnight, nor would it be prudent to put that much pressure on the system overnight. It's going to take a very gradual, slow growth process of about 10 or 12 years.
It's still challenging, one extra hatchery, tenfold increase in salmon. What's this, why is it growing so much in just a decade?
So John, when I was there, what I saw, and I was completely blown away by the way that they brood their fish. It's tray after tray after tray. There was one room that had several million just in this small room because of the way that they brood them, that they get them to become smolt. But you know, the other thing is this, and to Doug's point, it takes a while to build up to that. Because you've got to have fish coming back, and the reality is that those fish are coming back, and the orcas don't go, if I wait and don't eat that fish, it's going to be even bigger next year. So 97% of the fish are going to get taken just in the wild like that. They're not, you know, there's going to be no restraint there. And so the time to build the broodstock, but I wish everyone could go see the die-pack hatchery, because it is remarkable the way that they are, the way that they're producing such high numbers. It's just really something to see, and it's all based in the best science, which is what I would always hope for.
I think that you're probably right. I think a lot of us wish we could do it quicker, but I would hope that if you got this pilot program off, and within 2 years everybody sees it's working, and you could start another one some other place. So I think you have to go slow at it. You have to prove it. We have to make sure we get the eggs, the fish in the right areas. But I think we have to start somewhere, and no, we're not going to start and put 40 million out there. I think even Fish and Wildlife has to go slow in increasing their hatcheries. They can't do it overnight either. So this here is a pilot program. Start out small and increase, and then hoping to open it up to other areas as this proves out. Yes, sir.
David Giuliani, Low Carbon Prosperity Institute. I'm interested in what the capitalization is for this project. What's the plan?
So the question is, what is the capitalization of the project?
Yeah, the capital project is a two-part phased approach. The first phase would be a feasibility study, and that'd be fairly modest. But the capital project is thought to be in the $30 to $40 million range to produce the 40 million salmon each year.
And can I also address that?
Senator, you can always talk.
I can talk a lot. So the other piece is, though, that if you're familiar with Washington State's, a couple of different things we do. We have the Public Works Assistance Account, where we capitalize it and then we give low interest loans that are paid back, and that fuels other loans. So my ultimate goal would be that we would have that account, and then the hatchery, through its cost recovery, pays it back and then can fund other things. Down in my neck of the woods, we have a guy who's doing, and I support this in my legislation. He goes out, he harvests eggs in the fall. He's made his own little hatchery, and he hatches them, he releases them, and he's done it all out of his own pocket. Well, when the Lower Columbia Fish Recovery Board heard what he was doing, they wanted to not only support him, but they wanted to duplicate that program. So you could have home stewards who would have these little, down in our neck of the woods, and that's a part of this. They would be able to, in their own way, favorably impact, so that when you have a great many doing just a little bit, it really translates. So for me, I think that that capitalization piece can pay dividends. It can just continue to flow back, because we don't want to be like we were, several years back when people were sounding the alarm about the orcas, and people are going, pish posh, it's nothing. But now here we are, truly in crisis mode. And I will tell you, I've never met an orca personally. I've never talked to one, but I'm pretty sure that they don't have a party affiliation. And I'm pretty sure that they don't want to get bogged down in the discussion between, some type of a partisan fight. I'm known on the Hill as being very bipartisan, and I can see all sides of this. And so it's my hope that we can move beyond that. I tell you what, my bill is a first draft, and I want people to look at it. I want people to make suggestions and to come to the table so that we're really coming up with a fairly comprehensive approach. Part of it is pilot, the rest of it, let's just see what other things we can do to benefit the orcas and both recreational or all recreational tribal commercial fisheries.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Kelly Charlton. So I have a question about the revenue model. Can you talk a little bit more about the revenue model and how that works and how that scales up and is self-supporting over time?
So the question is about the revenue model. So can you go through the revenue, how it's generated, how it ramps up as more fish are being produced?
Sure. So in the state of Alaska, they have a provision that allows for a private nonprofit organization in a fisheries or hatchery environment. And they also provide for the ability to conduct what's called cost recovery fisheries. And the cost recovery fishery goes to the benefit of the hatchery. And so the fishermen, they bid to participate in that cost recovery fishery, which is a closed fishery, just for the folks that are going to collect the fish that are coming back to a terminal fishery location, meaning a remote release site where there's a water source that is originally water imprinted on that fish, so that when they come back eventually in 2 years, they come back to that water source. So the fishermen that win the bid to participate in that and collect that terminal fishery, recover that fish, deliver it to the dock. It's made available in name, in ownership, to the hatchery, who then transfers it to the highest bidder on a commercial basis. The proceeds of that then go back to benefit the hatchery, who then covers its annual operating budget, any of its capital improvement projects that they had for that year, and any of those things, until the point that they achieve full satisfaction of all those expenses. At that point, it turns back over to a open property, a common property fishery. So then the co-managers would decide upon openings where they'd say, okay, in our case, it's tribal are going to go out, say 6 a.m. on Saturday morning, and you can fish till 9 p.m. that night. The next day, non-tribal would go out 6 a.m. on Sunday. We fished, and each time we'd come back to a review meeting with WDFW and the tribes, and they'd assess what the biomass was thought to be, what was caught, what's remaining. Okay, let's do an 8-hour opening. And they keep feathering that down so that they don't overfish it, and they allow escapement, but we're also collecting brood stock during that whole process for the next year's seed corn, if you will.
So in the fishing catching of it, then, when the season, and you're naming the season, you guys are working with the tribes as well as
Absolutely. Yeah, the same co-management oversight and authorization would be in existence. We don't propose anything changed with that.
Yeah, let me just add one thing about the sort of the partisanship issue, which is that a lot of these issues, even the difficult ones, are done in a very bipartisan way. The legislation on the Columbia River The federal legislation was sponsored by Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler, a Republican from Southwest Washington. In the House and in the Senate, it was sponsored by Senator Cantwell, a Democrat. So there's a lot of bipartisan efforts. With as far as the orca go, the way they see these issues, they tend to be black and white.
Oh.
They could be black and white.
Yes. Okay, some people are making the argument that hatchery fish do not have as much nutrient value as wild fish, and therefore we shouldn't invest in hatcheries. So I'm wondering, is this argument reality or is it politics?
So can anybody on the panel, I hadn't heard that before, but can anybody on the panel talk about the difference between hatchery and wild, the nutrient value in that?
Yeah, I always like to say there's actually three choices. There's wild kings, there's hatchery kings, and there's no kings. And so, what would you rather have? We'd rather have wild kings, right? I mean, we'd rather not be augmenting the wild with these hatcheries. But the reality is, they're not able to sustain themselves to a level that is adequate for everything. So we know the hatchery system works, and I mentioned that yesterday in the Cordova Times publication, and it's online as well. I printed a copy of it last night. There's a very good article, it takes about 3 minutes to read it, about the chronology of the Alaskan hatchery program. And in 1969, they started with 25 million fish, and now one hatchery in Juneau produces 140 million fish, one hatchery. So that can happen. But back to the, do they like wild? Yes, they like wild. There are certainly, if you've latched on to a wild king salmon compared to a hatchery king, and it's taking line off of your spool, you know that that's a hot fish and it's just more robust. But there are nutrients in hatchery fish, and there's evidence that they are eating hatchery kings as well. So I see this as an augmentation, and it does work, and they will eat it. I know myself, I've got a number of different seafood companies that reside on our campus in Bellingham, and they have fleets of fishermen, and orcas do eat other species. They may not like to eat coho or chums or pinks or whatnot, but they will eat them. It's like us. We prefer filet mignon, but we'll eat popcorn when we have to. And so it's kind of a misnomer a little bit. I wouldn't say entirely, but it's certainly their target, their species. But yeah, I think it's wild, hatchery, or none. That's really the alternative.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There is some evidence that hatchery fish are smaller right now than wild fish because of genetics. So if you're a wild fish, you have to survive, and it's easier to survive if you're big and strong. Hatchery fish, there is the concern that the way that we have chosen them genetically favors fecundity, the number of fish produced as opposed to the strength of the fish. But Department of Fish and Wildlife, the tribes, groups like Long Live the Kings are involved in hatchery reform to try to improve the genetics, and even some cases use the wild to contribute to improving the genetics of the hatchery fish. So this is a known issue. It's not a dramatic issue. I think that there is room for improvement. I think it is too much to say, at least from the people I talk to say that orca prefer wild to a hatchery. But I think that there are efforts underway to improve the genetics of hatchery fish so that they're more like the large wild fish that we see.
So something that Todd said that spurred a memory of when we were at DIPAC is the actual genetics that they're working on because the fish that were back a little bit earlier. They weren't quite ready to harvest, and they were monsters. So we learned that they have been working on the genetics to make sure that they're not just putting out a lot of fish, but that the fish that they're putting out are very strong, have good genetic lines, and are coming back strong as well. So we know that that's happening at DIPAC, and it's just another part of the model that makes it so attractive to me.
Mike?
Yeah, I would say that over the past 10 years for the cost recovery model in Alaska, they've had 17% of the returns have funded the private nonprofit hatcheries on average. So that leaves a significant amount for all the other fisheries, but also to fund other programs. So one of the programs that they've funded is this multi-million-dollar study with University of Alaska, looking at exactly that, some of the issues with wild versus hatchery, and going out and doing the tissue samples. Some of the other things they funded is, they plant a bunch of rainbow fish in one of the local lakes. They do scholarships for students interested in studying the fisheries. A multitude of other projects, in addition to the millions of dollars they generate for their commercial and recreational fisheries. It creates a revenue stream. If you're only using 17% of your return to pay for the hatchery costs, there's additional revenue to fund things that to improve the hatchery system and the overall fisheries in general. So a lot of success stories up in Alaska.
Good. Do you want to make some comments from Fish and Wildlife?
So a lot of our programs are ran as integrated programs. So we bring wild fish into our broodstock on an annual basis. And so we run a large majority of our programs are integrated programs. But I'll speak to the pilot. In recommendation 6 in the Southern Resident Killer Whale Task Force report was for the department to work with long-lived kings and some of the tribal co-managers to work on hatchery pilot studies to improve adult or smolt to adult survival, as well as look at modifying how we raise fish and release fish from the hatcheries to get larger, older age fish back. And so we're definitely looking into that. We have studies ongoing around the state.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Todd, you mentioned that there are habitat opportunities that complement what can be done with the hatcheries per se. I'm wondering what some of the other habitat opportunities are other than predators that are cost effective and significant enough in scale and time to be meaningful.
Todd, you want to talk about habitat, what opportunities there are to the state spending more money? I'm sure you guys would have liked to have more money at the Salmon Recovery Board and stuff, but other places for that.
So the challenge with habitat is that it is a medium-term solution. Even when you're removing culverts, it takes time. Even though you immediately open up habitat, it still takes time. I mean, we removed the Elwha dams, which are essentially giant culverts blocking off habitat, and we still are not seeing significant increases in population. So it takes time. So it's a medium-term issue. The near-term issues are things like hatchery improvement and then reduction of predation. But in terms of habitat, there's lots of things to be done in Puget Sound. I am not someone who is known as advocating lots of new government spending. The reason I like the work that what's called PSAR, which is one of the habitat programs run by the Puget Sound Partnership, is that the grants, there's a list of proposals from different watersheds, and then there's a scientific basis about, okay, what's the best priority? Where are we going to get the most bang for our buck in terms of these various different projects, not just sort of locally, but regionally. And then you can actually see, okay, here's the most important thing, and then you move down the list. That, I think, is something that the partnership has done a very good job of recently, is being more rigorous about how it prioritizes things based on the science, not on politics. So last year, I think there were 12 projects on the PSAR list, and 3 or 4 got funded. This year there'll be a number of new ones on top of that. So there is no shortage of projects that we can do in Puget Sound if we have additional fund. And there's actually a list there of projects that are waiting for that funding.
Senator Rivers.
I would like to add, for our part, down in Southwest, we have to work with our federal partners more because we have opportunities for in-stream rearing, which is the penultimate and best thing that you can have. We have many, many islands as you go up the reach, the Columbia Reach. And so I think that that's another opportunity that we can look at. But again, it's going to take, it takes the partnership between the state and federal level. And I want to say, because if I'm Fish and Wildlife, I might be feeling just a touch beat up, but the reality is, I think that our Fish and Wildlife has done a great job. I think that this is just another path that we can take hand in hand to see if we can improve our returns and the strength of our runs, and to further protect the orcas.
Yep. Senator Rivers, is there a federal cooperativeness that might be able to take advantage of despite your issues?
You mean like an organization that's coming together? Well, I think it's the work with NOAA, you know, the nymphs, and actually I think there's a lot of cooperation with the fish recovery boards and the federal level. I know that in terms of habitat conservation plans and so forth, that cooperation exists, and it would seem to me just a very natural relationship to continue to strengthen as we look at other ways. You know, additionally, down where I am, we have the Bonneville Power Administration, who has some environmental responsibility, and I think that they would also lend to that cooperation as well, because everyone has to work together in order to meet the goals in the Endangered Species Act. So if we all work together, I just firmly believe that we're all going to win.
I think that, the federal government has to play a role, right? ESA, that's their responsibility. But if you ask NOAA Fisheries, because we're facing some potential delisting out in Hood Canal and places like that. And so when we ask them, okay, what does that mean? How do you set the criteria for delisting? And the answer we get is, we don't know, we've never done that. So that's not a critique of them. That's the way NOAA Fisheries and the federal government has to work because of the ESA. If you want innovation, if you want things done that can happen in a more rapid pace, the pace that we need, it's nice to have the federal government support, but it is the cherry on top. It is not something that you can rely on. And I can tell you that I have talked with tribal folks at their hatcheries who say they're very glad that they have that authority as on the tribal reservation land, that they don't have as much oversight, that they can do things that they could never do if they were the Department of Fish and Wildlife or if they were NOAA Fisheries or things like that. That flexibility is critical. It helps to be an independent nation, and the stakes are very high for the tribes. They don't want to screw anything up, right? They're very careful because they rely on those salmon. So they have strong incentives to make sure that the things they do are done well and intelligently. But it also means that the incentives are very high for them to not sit around. And that was one of the things Billy Frank said is, we don't have to wait for anybody. We can start to do the things our way. So, and I think that's very useful. And to the extent that we can create organizations that have a little more flexibility, the opportunity to do some of those things, that's a good thing.
As a point of clarification, the islands down in my neck of the woods are in the middle of the Columbia, so they're federally, we need the feds to be able to do the things that we want to do. We need their permission. So I appreciate Todd's comments, because I agree with him. I think that our tribal friends really do hold the key because they have the flexibility, and it would be great if we could continue to develop those relationships for all of us to be able to capitalize on that.
So I'm being told we need to end it, so I'll give you one last question.
Thank you. So is there any interest from the tribes to independently use this model to work in parallel with the ideas that are being put forth today?
So the question is there any inclination from the tribes to do the same thing that you're proposing in Bellingham? Have the tribes looked at doing it themselves that you know of?
Yeah, the tribes, the Lummi tribe, have been participating in our meetings. I wouldn't say that they have wholeheartedly, embraced it. Have they been thinking about doing this themselves? I don't know if they've been thinking about doing it themselves in the Alaska model way. I have a feeling that they have been thinking about doing a hatchery on their own using traditional means.
So I'll give anybody on the panel last closing thoughts or anything. You said everything, or give you an opportunity.
Well, I'm a politician, so no. I want to thank everyone for coming today. I'm appreciative of the mainstream Republicans for hosting this event. I think we cannot understate the crisis that currently exists. I think that it is my hope that everyone will come to the table and engage with me on legislation that is meaningful and more immediate. The whales are hungry now, and I think we ought to do our level best to feed them now. So thanks again for coming. If you want to engage with me, I welcome that. If you love fish, then you're welcome at my campfire.
So I would close by saying there again, thank you, Senator Rivers, for taking this on and presenting this legislation. Thank you to the Main Street Republicans for doing this event. As I think it was Todd said, this is only one issue of helping the orcas. We have many, many others in the state. When I was asked from the task force, how do we think we fared in the legislature? I don't think we did very well. I don't think we did well on the hatchery side. I don't think we did well on the habitat side. We have a long ways to go in water quality, in stormwater runoff, and those measures that also are affecting the water quality and affecting the orcas. And so this is one aspect. It's an important one. I'm glad we're taking this one on as we move forward, and hopefully as we provide more fish, we will continue seeing more orcas in the future. So thank you all very much. Thank you.